Hello, everyone. My name is Todd Verrill. I'm with the IQ Business Group, and I'm happy to be your moderator for today's webinar, Empower Your Business with Digital-Born Strategies. I'm joined today by Ryan Britton, Senior Microsoft Consultant, and my colleague Maggie Vandenberg with IQBG Marketing. As part of our Webinar Wednesday series, we are proud to sponsor today's webinar to support our public and private sector folks, including federal, state, local, and municipal, and our private sector friends as well, seeking knowledge and insight for effective information management, including making the most out of your Microsoft 365 investment. Before we dive into moving to a born digital strategy, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. As always, by default, your mics are going to be muted. Please submit any questions through the chat. And today's webinar will be made available to all participants for replay within about 24 hours. So please be on the lookout for an email notification. We're going to dive right into our first poll question on today's subject before we get started. And we'd love to get your input on how familiar you are with born digital strategy. So if you don't mind, we'll give everyone just a few seconds to select a radio button before we move on. This helps us identify our audience a little bit better and provide you with the best content possible.
Okay, 82% of people have now voted. 20% say they've never heard of it. 40% say they've heard the term and they're curious. 30% have some familiarity. And 10% say they know the term and strategies well.
Kind of expected, and we see this a lot. Very good. Thank you for the results, Maggie. Very quickly, for IQBG, as we are known, we are a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the public sector and highly regulated industries. Since around 2008, we've been developing ECRM and content services solutions that always leverage people, process, and technology that support your requirements. We always focus on business first, including your entire information and records management life cycles and how information management is impacted throughout all levels of your enterprise. This allows us to focus on technology next. And with that focus on technology, I get to work with wonderful folks like my co-presenter Ryan as we recommend best possible solutions. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Todd, and hello, everybody. My name is Ryan Britton. I represent a global organization called Mint, who is a top-tier Microsoft partner. We're active in a number of territories, including Northern American territories, and we have worked with Microsoft for over 20 years as one of their close partners, working with the product teams with gold competencies across all of the pillars that they offer under their suite of products. And we are most active inside highly regulated industries such as financial services, education, healthcare, and government. So pleased to be here.
Thanks, Ryan. So let's begin by framing up the problem as always. Ryan, I think you'll agree that we're in a unique place when it comes to information and records management and all things information governance. Today's information management technology landscape, if you will, is considerably more diverse and in some cases nuanced than the dedicated enterprise content and records management, or ECRM, solutions of the past. Many of those business process specific and application specific capabilities that were offered as single point solutions are now marketed as fully baked, multifunctioning platforms providing content services, heavy on ease of access and collaboration. Throwing aside of COVID times and this new working environment where folks need to access information wherever and whenever, and we have the modern workplace. So what does that mean? Well, if it wasn't difficult enough to do before, making sufficient progress in developing information governance programs is quite a chore. And I'm getting to the punchline here with going digital with your strategy. But for instance, the ARMA Information Governance Maturity Index that goes out every year, the most recent one shows that the authorities section, now these are the elements that serve as the guide rail, so to speak, for any organization's InfoGov efforts. They're roughly the rules that help guide information governance decisions. They exhibit another downtrend for 2021. Just 30% report a maturity level of proactive or transformational. So we're thinking, this digital stuff, although the technology is not old, the capability to grasp processes and drive it and manage it is still a challenge, because 70% report essential maturity or below. So that's the difference we see between proactive and reactive. And Ryan, as you know, having a digital born strategy in any of these spaces is going to be proactive for sure. So, that's where IQBG and Mint come in. We are focused on the shift and on the growth of content services and the Microsoft 365 platform. So now more than ever, our connected world requires what we call an outcome-focused approach to planning and managing all of the apps, the products, the services that drive your business using Microsoft 365. So we want to talk a little bit about smart compliance. It is our outcome as a service offering designed to provide a turnkey solution for compliance and governance within the modern workplace. And we do this through a combination of three primary elements. That's expert consultation, industry best practices, and managed services. So while the tools continue to evolve and improve, it always has been, and Ryan, I think it always will be, some level of people, process, and technology as that common denominator. So we're gearing up for the shift, we're driving change, and we know we need to adapt. And for today's topic, digital born, Ryan, is imperative now more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the smart compliance framework that we're talking about has been born of a consultancy effort between the IQ Business Group and the Mint Group in highly regulated industries over the last 5 years. What we've noticed, and this mandala that you see depicted here essentially speaks to a lot of the problems that we find organizations are trying to solve in the information governance space. There's a move towards cloud and transforming businesses, and a need to transform the information landscape from what we see historically in traditional businesses. And we're seeing a lot of platforms that are starting to enable that. Obviously, as a Microsoft consultancy, we focus primarily on the Microsoft 365 platform as the information platform where we seek to expedite these types of governance workloads. But essentially what we're finding is that Microsoft partners are used to expediting very, very specific point solutions and activating the products and getting people onboarded. And in some cases, that might mean that we have some folks who have most of their information on premise and they're looking to move it to the cloud, or they have antiquated record keeping software and they're looking to modernize. All of these types of problems. And essentially, we find that a lot of partners or organizations may be equipped to come in and assist in setting up SharePoint, activating the licenses, moving the information into the cloud. Unfortunately, if your organization is like a lot of other organizations, and your information has grown organically over time, and although your record system perhaps is up to date, you have working documents that are spread across file shares and sitting inside line of business applications, it's not good enough to just take that problem and move it to the cloud, for instance. There's quite a lot of interlocking solutions that you need to get right in order to not only transform the business to digital-born information strategy, but also to prepare the platform so that when you do move to the cloud, for instance, you're not moving the problem and essentially sitting with the same problem that you now have to deal with inside of the cloud. And so this wheel that you see in front of you is quite detailed and covers a lot of different types of areas. And what you'll notice, and we're definitely not going to delve into it, is that there are proactive and reactive elements to an information management strategy. In some cases, you definitely want to be led by good strategic investment to guide the operational efforts to create this type of solution. You need automation, you need governance, you need to weigh risk, you need to manage the risk properly. And essentially the rings of the onion in the middle there speak to different layers of a solution that you have to put in place one by one in order to get to a place where you are able to do physical records management, manage your digital assets, where you're able to layer on top of that information governance and collaboration and teamwork and security and all of those things that are buzzwords that we hear in the media that are becoming a necessity for organizations to concentrate on. So quite a mouthful out the gate. Essentially, just what I wanted to leave you with is that the problem of information governance is a large one and a complicated one. And it's for this reason that the Smart Compliance webinar series focuses on different aspects for each one of the series. Today's talk, as you know, is about digital-born information, and certainly it fits into various places onto this mandala, and you will see how it resonates in terms of different strategies as we walk through the deck. Hopefully, we've got some good and interesting things to leave you with, and we hope that you'll leave a little bit better informed if you weren't beforehand, and have a good understanding of why this buzz is so important for transformational organizations who are seeking a good information strategy.
All right,
Okay.
and we have another poll. Okay, most people have voted now. 29% say that most of their processes contain some analog information. 43% say most of our information is analog and we are moving to digital. 29% say most of our information is currently digital. And that's it.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's start the discussion by first talking about what we mean when we talk about born digital. The official terminology says that it's denoting text or recordings produced on digital form rather than having been converted from print or analog equivalents. And not too long ago, if you asked anyone to talk about the information life cycle, what you'd find is that most information started off its life as physical information. And really the only reason that you would digitize it would be for record keeping purposes, disaster recovery, those types of things. Essentially, our digital ecosystem wasn't mature enough to be able to consider fully automated and fully digital processes and information that had no counterpart that was an actual physical record or physical piece of physical asset. And so what some organizations are pursuing, and it's become a buzzword in the media, is seeking to try and create most of its information in a digital format from cradle to grave. In other words, there is no analog representation of that information within the organization. And obviously that can be easy or difficult depending on the type of organization, the type of workflow, the type of assets that we're talking about. And that's really what we're here to unpack today. Next slide. Okay, so why do we care about this born digital thing? There's a few things that are pushing the popularity of this type of strategy. The first one is the decreased carbon footprint requirement that we're seeing across the globe. Folks are looking for ways to decrease the amount of paper, decrease the amount of carbon consumption that they have, and essentially pursuing green goals in terms of their organizations, and going paperless is a good way to do that. Another thing that pushes people is the storage costs of paper, which can be significantly more than digital storage space. The transport costs of paper. So as organizations become more fractured and have remote workers and have multiple branches and have global presence, the cost of transporting paper backwards and forwards becomes something to consider in terms of your information strategy. And it's also a good place to save money if you can then digitize information and transport it via the internet instead, or a VPN or so forth. The processing costs of paper, to fill out an electronic form is a lot more cost effective than to do it by hand, and then to try and digitize that back into some record keeping system. Modernizing business processes, creating efficiencies through automation, allowing information to be mined by AI and machine learning, and to use that information to make strategic decisions within the business. That is obviously a lot more difficult to do if most of your information is analog. The susceptibility of paper to the elements. We have an organization in the US that we've been dealing with who had their records stored in the basement of a building, and there was a huge flood and it flooded the building. And that's something that can realistically happen. We have another client whose document storage warehouse burnt down. And these types of disasters are unfortunately becoming something we see much more of in the news day by day. And obviously, if you have a digital copy of information and it's spread across 3 regions, you are much less susceptible to those types of things. Susceptibility of paper to age, especially if you need to keep documents for decades. And then the impedance mismatch. So if you are going to make analog records searchable and discoverable, and you're going to have metadata, you need to store that metadata in an information system. And so you've got physical records that exist somewhere, and then you've got a twin of that record that exists somewhere which represents it in the digital world so that you can search for it more easily, etc. The problem with that is that it may happen that there is a mislabeling, or that a box is moved without consideration, or something along those lines. And essentially what happens is your record keeping system no longer represents reality. That requires a continuous audit process to make sure that those stay aligned. But there is a risk of this impedance mismatch between what is physically represented and what's represented in the digital world. Next slide, please. So why does it matter now? There's a few things that make this a critical time to be considering a born digital approach to information governance. The first is that there has been explosive growth of information. The amount of information in the world has grown by 10 times in the last 7 years, and it is expected to grow even more in the next 5 years. And so within your own organization, you can imagine that if your organization is more than 7 years old, you have 10 times the amount of information you did 7 years ago, and that problem is going to compound as we go forward. And so getting to a place where if that information is mostly analog, and you still have this explosive growth, how do you manage that in terms of storage space, in terms of increased processing costs, in terms of mitigating the risk of aging of paper, those types of things? Because of that explosive, that almost unstoppable growth of information within organizations, turning analog processes into more manageable digital processes, and analog assets into digital assets will make them more manageable if you have a good information governance platform to do that within. Digital transformation of organizations has been accelerated by COVID. So where an analog process once made sense, now that organization has had to adopt remote working, and it's no longer cost effective to process analog information with workers sitting at home and to try and transport that to some central location, for instance. There is an increased focus on information regulation globally, and that means that regardless of whether it's a digital record or an analog record, you have certain regulations that you have to adhere to, and things like managing PII requests for the destruction of personal information and those types of things, or the surrendering of personal information, is much more costly if you're talking about analog information. In 1921 and similar federal directives. I'm not going to get stuck into that now because we do have a few slides that delve into these types of tightening regulations that we're seeing across the globe. And then finally, carbon regulations for organizations, where government is actually putting pressure on private sector and government organizations as well to reduce their carbon footprint with specific goals. And that really means that organizations are being forced to think about how they can reduce their carbon footprint over a period of time. Next slide.
Thanks, Ryan.
Okay.
And yes, M1921, one of the biggest topics of the year and years to come for any federal folks on the call. And we can kind of get those results out of our second poll question. This is the epitome of digital transformation. M1921 is nothing new. It's really a supersession of what used to be M1218 that focused on email management. Now the focus is on the digitization and management of all permanent electronic records. And we're right on course with M1921 via timeline, which builds upon the key goals from M1218. But next slide, please. We'll take a little closer look. M1921 now encompasses, like I said, all federal records, temporary or permanent. And the targets require that by 12/31/22, right around the corner, both permanent and temporary records are created, retained, and managed in electronic format. And in addition, agencies are required to convert records to electronic or store them in commercial storage facilities after the December 31st, 22 deadline. So we're getting right into all things digital transformation, all things that would be representative of a digital strategy. And still going on M1921, let's review how we got here. This is a high level and not an all-inclusive timeline, but I picked a few things that I thought were important because ERM policy in the federal government goes way back to November of 2011 with the MGRD memo. But things that stand out, December 31st, 2019, that was an eye-opener for a lot of agencies. As part of the M1218 goal number 1, agencies were required to manage permanent records in electronic format. So this was kind of the thing that started everyone with digital transformation, trying to understand what to do next, what steps to take, and in many cases, define a digital strategy. But we know every agency has not been perfect in doing that. That's why we have our friends at NARA who have developed a lot of great guidance along the way. I won't crunch all the dates, but the dates in the middle are guidance and policy updates that NARA provided to assist agencies with their plans. But if we fast forward December 31st, 2022, that's the target right now. And the countdown is on, as you know, to manage all records electronically and transfer or convert paper with the day forward approach of January 1st, 2023. And that includes digital only transfers to NARA. NARA will not accept any more paper. So Ryan, if there was one giant thing that stood out as far as why do I need a digital strategy and I happen to work in the federal government, that is a huge one. Ryan, what you don't see on this timeline is something very important, and that's the progression or the shift that we have talked about time and time again of information technology, which is a key piece of this. Because right now we've got a timeline and we can get rolling, right? Here's the catch. There's always going to be those compliance requirements, the business and mission requirements, and now additional requirements in many cases to consider as records management now spans what we refer to as the information ecosystem or landscape with Microsoft 365. So where to start can be overwhelming, and a lack of digital strategy only intensifies the challenge. But for everyone on the call, it's going to be okay, because Ryan will also agree with me, those fundamental goals and challenges associated with mandates like M1921, they're nothing new to IQBG and Mint. We've been helping federal, state, and local government agencies and private sector, as far as that goes, meet these digital strategy requirements like reduction or elimination of paper, electronic record keeping. We've been doing this for over a decade. And in doing so, we've helped agencies improve their records management programs with the solutions we've provided. But here's the deal again, they all involve a level of people, process, and technology. So that's a good takeaway. That takes us into our poll number 3 question, Maggie. What percentage of your data is managed in the cloud? Great question.
Okay, we've got a fairly even split here. 25% say 0 to 25% of their data is in the cloud. 38% say that number is 26 to 75%. And the last 38% say 76 to 100%. Good for y'all in that last group.
I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so when you hear folks talk about born digital information strategies, it's almost synonymous with a discussion about born digital organizations. And so we figured we should probably cover that, since it's going to come up if you're looking at these types of strategies. What we're finding is that there are some organizations who have the luxury of not having to deal with legacy analog information stores. These are generally your tech startups who, have as I said, the luxury of being able to say, well, we'll just start with a born digital operation. All of our record keeping will be electronic, all of our processes will be automated, and we'll essentially adopt that at the get-go. And what that means is that these organizations are ahead of the curve in terms of their strategy when we look at cloud adoption, digital transformation, agility from a technology perspective, simply because they don't have that legacy. And that unfairly puts some traditional organizations at a disadvantage simply because they have to deal with these large stores of analog information. They have to try and figure it out. It may not even be analog information. It may be organically grown file shares that span 20 years that perhaps don't have record keeping policies being applied to them currently, and the organization has a keep everything policy with regards to information. And now, as they start to think about moving to a digital-based professional economy within the organization, it becomes very difficult to say, well, what do we do with this information? We can't dump it. We recognize that there's probably value inside of it. There's probably some liability in there as well, but we have to try and move it. We have to try and sort it out. We have to do something with it. And so what we're finding is that everybody, or most organizations, are somewhere on this digital maturity scale, and most of them are seeking to become more digitally mature, as we realize that digital maturity is one of the things that really enables new business models and folks to unseat traditional organizations who have been incumbent within an industry for decades, simply because they do something in a more innovative way at a better cost point, whatever the case may be. And so you know, when you see someone like NARA putting in place regulation that says that they're going to stop accepting analog records and only accept them in electronic format, that's really putting a lot of pressure onto agencies who now have to move forward with a strategy to understand what those information stores look like and start to digitize them where possible, destroy analog stores if they are candidates for disposition, those types of things. And so something that a question you might ask yourself if you're looking at this slide is to think about where you sit on this scale. Do you have the luxury of being a digitally born organization who can embrace a digital born strategy out the gate? If not, and you're more traditional and you're aware of the fact that you have huge stores of analog and digital information sitting on premise, for instance, when you are considering a cloud strategy, now is the time to really sink your teeth into that, because the quicker you can process that information and move to more automated digital processes, the more agile you become, the more competitive you become with regards to these types of organizations. Next slide. So you can go back one. I think we went on one slide too much there. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about some hindrances to born digital strategies. Some of the things that stop us from getting started on really considering what would it mean if our organization fully digitized its information and fully automated all of its processes, and is that something that's a possibility? Some of the things that might be a huge inhibitor to that would be the volume of existing data. We deal with some customers who have petabytes worth of information spanning decades, and to think about what we do with that if we start to consider and not even petabytes, we're talking about analog information, warehouses filled with boxes that you would have to consider a path to digitization for. And that's an expensive process. It requires a lot of manpower in many cases. The question that organizations have to ask themselves, though, is at some point, it probably will become necessary. What is that point? A lack of organization. It's very, very common for us to work within organizations where we find business units who are very good with their information and everything is properly cataloged and they have records filings and the information is moved to a third-party system which does the records management. And then in the office next door, there's another business unit that has grown its information organically. It doesn't have a set categorization. There are candidates for records that are not being converted into records and not being transferred into proper record keeping processes, and so forth. Siloed information is another problem, either physically siloed or otherwise in terms of different departments, different business units, etc. Uncertainty where to begin. So if you know that this is something that you need to tackle, where do you start? It's not as if you can get a team of people together and just tackle the warehouse on Monday morning. And sometimes thinking about how to get the right endorsement, build the right strategy, put the right operational processes in place, think about digitization, learn how to prioritize data, all of these types of things are difficult to get into a roadmap if you don't know where to begin. Digital readiness, you can't pursue a digital born strategy if your digital maturity is so low that you don't have the right platform set up for information governance in an electronic form. The organizational culture. We've run into a number of organizations where when we worked with them, the movement from being an analog culture and working that way to becoming a digital culture are mountains apart, and sometimes crossing that divide can be quite a journey. Technology strategy, that may be lacking in some organizations, and that can be a hindrance. You know, if your organization isn't equipped to provide the technology needed to create a digital born strategy, it's difficult to even look at the information governance pieces of it. Lack of vision or endorsement goes without saying. And this is something that hamstrings a lot of these types of efforts, is that if you don't have support from the top, it may fail. Oh, excuse me. And then finally, the inability to build a business case to show ROI. In a, excuse me. In a lot of cases, pursuing a digital born strategy can actually bring a return on investment, but you have to know how to structure it in such a way and how to present the business case. So it's not just good gracious me, I apologize. It's not just about this is not just an expense and not just a bugbear and not just a, and it may seem that way when you have organizations like NARA dictating the fact that electronic record keeping must become the norm. But actually, the process of automation, of reducing physical storage costs, of reducing processing costs, transport costs, this is something that you can use to build a business case to show how the business can become profitable from the process of better information governance, more profitable. Next slide, please. Okay. It's not all a silver bullet, it never is. So you move from one set of problems that are on an analog base to another set of problems that are digital. And these are just things that you need to be aware of if you're considering a strategy of moving analog information to digital information, because digital information has its own quirks. Things like bit rot, which essentially says that if you're storing your information on a single hard drive, over time, the nature of the electromagnetic processes that produce that information means that that hard drive will lose info over time. And so you need to make sure that you are building redundancies in place from a data storage perspective. Obsolete media, if you were storing your records on CDs or floppy disks or stiffy disks at a stage, you would find that it would be very difficult for you to retrieve that data now. Obsolete hardware, things like things that fall into disuse like tape, those types of things where it becomes more and more difficult to actually obtain the hardware needed to actually access the media. Obsolete software. You may have your record stored in a particular format, and now you can't retrieve it anymore because the business that provided the software that you need to read that file format is now out of business, for instance. And then finally, data authenticity and integrity. And there are OASIS and the OASIS format is a well-known format for the way that you store digital information, and you need to be cognizant of the fact that this has things like fixity and that built into it that you need to consider, so that when you are storing digital data, you're not just saying, well, I can just copy a file somewhere and that's what is required from an electronic record keeping perspective. Actually, you need to take certain steps in terms of data authenticity and integrity to ensure that that information is both protected in terms of its format as well as in terms of its original media and binary content. We can go on to the next one. Some more considerations for digital preservation. You want to think about versioning and version retention. Do you store draft versions? Do you store final versions? How many versions do you store? What is the process behind that? And in a lot of cases, the answer to these types of questions is it depends, and you'll see different strategies for different types of information, and that's how it should be. Essentially, it just means that you want to be considerate of the fact that if you are taking a copy of a document for record keeping purposes at a certain point in time, that document may continue to evolve in digital format, and that you need to be thinking about what the versioning of that stuff looks like. Privacy considerations, where even if you're record keeping, you need to be thinking about some of the regulations that we're seeing at the forefront in terms of PII, the ability when you can and can't expose people's personal information, whether that's accessible, and what you do if people have requested that you destroy that personal information. Digital rights. Something to consider is that you may be keeping certain types of information that are attached to a digital rights management system, and that actually the right to store, the right to play, the right to retrieve, all of those types of things are things that you need to consider with digital content. And closely tied to that is licensing, not only licensing of the information, but licensing of the application that you might need in order to retrieve that information. It's a terrible thing to be in a position where you're not getting line of business value from a specific piece of software, but you have to continue to license it simply because you need to be able to retrieve the files for record keeping purposes or to read them. Who's responsible for the information, and finally access to information, and not just access to information now, but access over time. If we are storing information for decades, that is likely to change, and you need to think about how access evolves over time and what your strategy is to maintain the right levels of access as the organization changes, as the type of mechanisms we use to determine identity and authorize people change as well. Next slide. Okay, so just some thoughts on how to tackle a born digital strategy. This is not conclusive by any means. This is really just talking points to give everyone on the call something to think about. But essentially, most strategies will have a series of stages that are likened to what you see here. Before you can tackle the problem, you need to know the size of the problem. And so most organizations should start by analyzing the information that they have. Usually what the conversations that we have when we say analyze your information may run along the lines of, well, we have too much information and the cost of it and how do we go about. And in those cases, there are strategies that you can follow to at least, for instance, determine the difference between business critical data and rot and dark data, and then to perhaps focus on a smaller subset of the information so that you can start to understand what information resides in these places. Think about the types of analog records that you have. In some cases, it may be large video, it may be, think about the different types of analog records that you have and how to deal with them differently. How you digitize them is obviously different depending on the type of record. The digital equivalents of those. So as you understand what each of these analog records look like, you start to think about, well, what will this look like if we then pursue a digital equivalent of it? So for instance, if you have a record type that is a hand filled out form and you're thinking about digitizing that, do you go through a process of doing OCR? Do you pull that information out? Is that stored as metadata? These are the types of things that you want to understand as you're evaluating analog record types versus their digital counterparts. Thinking about information silos and thinking about digital readiness and maturity for the system that you're intending to put the analog records into, for instance. So if you're pursuing a solution where you're going to take several million analog records, process them, scan them, digitize them, OCR them, and get them into an electronic format, the destination system needs to be of a level of maturity that it can accept the volume of data, that it can process the batches at a speed that makes sense, that the storage makes sense from a cost perspective. All of these types of things are part of a digital readiness and maturity journey. Then you want to strategize. This falls hand in hand with the idea that you must have top-down endorsement for this. As part of an IT strategy for the organization and a digital transformation strategy for the organization, you also want an information governance, compliance, and a born digital transformation strategy for your information landscape. And these should be written into the strategic documents of the business so that you have North Stars to guide the process as you start to dig into how to pick apart the different types of information and how you're going to go about either automating them, digitizing them, turning them into an electronic format, whatever the case may be. Part of that strategy would include green goals, and obviously you want a compliance roadmap as well. One of the things that we're seeing is that when you move to an electronic record keeping system or an electronic information management system, that it becomes a lot more viable to pursue continuous compliance. In other words, you can evaluate your level of compliance against a particular regulation and then measure that continuously. So as you take steps to reduce the amount of uncategorized information, to protect certain types of sensitive info, your compliance rating will change. And so compliance moves from something that happens every year, every 3 years, whatever the case may be, and is outdated by 2 weeks after that external audit has happened, to something that you're able to measure and attest to on a day-to-day basis. Migration, digitization, information governance, compliance all need to form part of a plan. Tackle low-hanging fruit first. Think about what your return on investment is for pursuing these types of efforts. Understand what your physical storage costs are, what your digital storage costs will be, what the potential saving there is, what the cost of processing would be. All of these types of things need to go into a comprehensive plan that allows you to tackle the silos of information that exist within the organization. And then finally, the implementation, where you'll design information architecture and a content ecosystem, build system integrations into your ERP systems or line of business applications, that information flow to and from the collaboration pieces of the info ecosystem are matched and the seams match. Think about a center of excellence and a community of practice, so actual bodies to drive the practice of information governance, the measurement thereof, the things that will turn an organization culturally and in terms of a reflection of its processes into an organization that follows information governance best practices as a daily habit. Policies and processes, and obviously automation is a great example of another place where significant cost savings could be possible moving from analog to digital. And then finally, operationalize everything and thinking about things like how does e-discovery work, PII requests, think about workspaces on a per business unit basis, because business units will work with information in different ways. You need to understand what type of information they have and what their workflows look like, what disposition looks like. And then finally, things like training and change management, which are absolutely essential in order to ensure that that cultural shift can happen for organizations that are more comfortable in the analog world than they are in the digital world. Next one.
And Ryan, as our guests take our next quick poll, great information here. I'd like to stress what we call focusing on the bookends as you get into more strategy and more considerations moving forward in the slides. But what we find is if we get folks to focus on where they are currently, where their program is currently, and by that I mean assessments, to understand where your program is and then setting a target. We know there's lots and multiple targets involved in all of the things we're talking about today, but focus on the targets where your RM program needs to be. And if you focus on those bookends, we find that a lot of this stuff in the middle begins to evolve and happen and take place. And what I mean by that is I always go back to the RM side of things, meaning if you have an RM program that is set up with the business in mind and your regulatory requirements, your records management requirements, all of that stuff is baked into your RM. What you don't end up doing is merely having regulatory requirements dictate what your RM program does, but instead you leverage your InfoGov program, including today's topic, digital strategy, to drive that compliance. So to your comment, this doesn't stop. It's continually focused moving forward. So how's our quick poll looking, Maggie?
Okay, so 33% say to reduce analog records with digital ones. 33% say to reduce storage, transport, and processing costs. 33% say to create better redundancy and resiliency for record keeping. And a whopping 83% say to provide better discoverability of information.
Wow. Okay, so some strategies for success then. and hopefully after some of the things we've spoken about on previous slides, this is self-evident. Vision and mission definitely matter. So if part of your organization's vision and mission involves transforming your information ecosystem to be more digital, you'll find that your operational processes will start to align with that. It's very difficult to put a program like this in place if it's not part of the overall strategy, if it's a bugbear or it's a parallel or ancillary program that isn't really endorsed from the top down. You can experiment with business models. So the process of taking analog processes and digitizing them allows you to become more agile in terms of the way that you interact with that information. And that means that you can start to do things like open up new avenues of interaction with customers, organizations, agencies, vendors, these types of things, make those processes more efficient, and ultimately perhaps make your business model, your tasks, or your mission more enabled, just because the process of working with digital information has so many more facets than analog information locks you down to. Employ a person-centric and a team-centric approach. So you definitely don't want to turn this into a policy hammer that you hit everyone over the head with. If you approach the fact that becoming or moving to a digital-born information ecosystem means that it's going to make people's lives better because they will have less admin, they will be more efficient, they can focus on the things that are more strategic in their job role rather than things that are repetitive or mundane. These types of things are great ways to make sure that you get the right commitment from folks as you start to roll out this type of strategy. And so you don't want to design this and then impose it on people. Instead, you want to go to each business unit, understand their information, design a strategy that works for them, show them the benefits, and build it out with them. The process of doing that means that you'll build a lasting set of habits for good information governance first off, but also that you build yourself a runway for making that cultural change that we were talking about that's so important. Then make data-driven decisions. So much easier to invest into something if the data speaks for itself. If you go through a process of analyzing the quantity of information that you have in analog format and the cost of then maintaining that, and how much is likely to grow over a period of time and how much that will cost in 5 years' time, and then taking all of that information and comparing it with information that comes off of a designed digital process which would replace this, and having a look at the actual figures and saying, well, this is what does it make financial sense, and if it does, pursuing it. Making those types of data-driven decisions are much better than going to a board and saying, we need to, NARA has imposed this on us and so we need to get it done, and it's basically a grudge purchase from the outset, and we're not thinking about how to really make this work for us in terms of efficiencies, profitabilities, all of those things. Staff for information governance, so information design, maintenance, records management, even collaboration these days. Designing all of these workspaces requires a certain set of skills. And certainly you can get consulting organizations like IQ and Mint to assist in developing those skills within the staff complement, but it would be an error to believe that you can do something like just switch on Microsoft Teams and folks will get good at designing what a Teams workspace would look like and how to work with information within that ecosystem, because that doesn't happen. And what can happen then is, 12 months down the line, you look back and you've got 500 teams and no one knows what information is sitting inside of those teams or how to corral that back into some kind of records management workflow, and so it can go south quite quickly. Information governance is certainly a set of skills that needs to be explicitly applied to the ecosystem in order to get the best benefit from it. Weigh risk and liability. We've had a lot of occasions where we've worked with certain organizations and they said to us that they don't know what their liability is because they've got a few terabytes of information that's been sitting there, and they don't know what's in it it could be a liability. The unfortunate truth of that matter is that if you move something like that into the cloud, it becomes discoverable, and the liability becomes a lot more apparent. And likewise, if you're looking at analog records and you don't know what the liability would be, if, for instance, there is personally identifiable information in those stores, you need to understand what the risk and liability is before you digitize it and move it into the cloud so that you're able to deal with that effectively. Because again, once it's in the cloud, if you do a search for a particular case number or an ID number or a social security number, what have you, it will return results simply because the indexing and the searching and the discoverability is so much better. And then finally, build a business case with an ROI, which we've spoken about.
Hey, Ryan, sorry to interrupt. Time flies when you're having fun. It looks like we're down to about 5 minutes, so I was going to maybe suggest summarizing infrastructure, data integrity, format, and security, and we can rock it out. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to run through the next slides quite quickly. In fact, I'm just going to let you guys read through them, and I'll talk to them in summary format. If we can quickly progress to the next slide. Okay, so the next few slides are just some considerations broken down into some categories. I'm not going to go through them because they should be quite self-evident. There are some infrastructure considerations, and it shouldn't surprise you that these are things to do with storage, networking, affordable, managed, replicated content storage, the processes, tools to inventory born digital files, tools for forensic identification, standardized workflow processes for associating born digital and digital surrogate files with record identifiers, lots and lots and lots of things for infrastructure and IT teams to do. If you move on to the next slide. There are also some data integrity considerations, and these have to do with creating a log of ingestion events and storing multiple records of each type of file, and making sure that you do malware scanning and checking fixity of files, performing audits, and regular audits of logs to identify any anomalies. And finally, just making sure that if you are using a certain type of media and records are expected to be there for a longer period of time, that you are testing and verifying that you are able to retrieve that information as well. So lots to do from a data integrity perspective as well. As we said, moving from analog to digital is not a silver bullet. There's definitely a lot of elements that go into a good strategy. Next slide, please. Okay, and then format and media sustainability, and we've touched on this quite a lot in other slides as well, but essentially what we're talking about is that you must know the file formats of everything that you are storing, have an action plan to identify formats that might not be sustainable, create normalized versions of files, store them in a format that has a longer, is less likely to become obsolete, perform automated manual format migrations, and monitor large preservation community and technological environment for any changes. So in other words, watch the media, because they will alert you to changes that might make certain files become obsolete, for instance. If something becomes end of life from an operating system perspective or a software perspective, that's something to watch for. Next slide, please. Okay, and then finally, security considerations. This is front and center, even more than it ever has been. Organizations can no longer protect their information by keeping it within four walls. And so we need to make sure that we understand physical security, how to manage the ingestion process, how to define access permissions and how to manage them over time, manage the right review schedules, make sure that no one person has right access to all the files, and maintain a system of record log actions to files to include deletions and preservation actions as well, so that you have defensible preservation. For instance, if you've gone through a disposition process on a file, you have a log that tells you why that happened. Next slide.
And that takes us to our final poll question. If we, looks like people are hanging on. Thanks so much for sticking with us. If we could put the poll question back up, Maggie, we'll finish our final poll. And while that's happening, I'd like to wrap it up with what I view today's slides being all about. And thank you again, Ryan, for presenting. But to me, digital is nothing new. And outside of those unique compliance cases where, say, shifting from physical to electronic is that primary requirement. It's the management of digital that continues to present challenges. We've got things like Microsoft 365. It's both the enabler and it's presenting challenges alike. So those new norm solutions in the information landscape, providing collaboration, enabling users to generate information at record pace, only exacerbate challenges if information governance is not put in place. We end up with too much email, team sprawl, etc. So assessing, strategizing, and planning are the key. And part of that information governance program is digital strategy, something both IQ and Mint take great pride in assisting our clients with, so much that we would like to help some folks on today's call with the final slide to help do a little bit of planning, and that is our workshop offer.
So 60% of people said they need some direction. Y'all are going to be really interested in this workshop offer.
Absolutely.
Okay, so essentially what we've put together in order to help all the folks who have been kind enough to give us their time on this call and to talk through the exciting prospect of a born digital strategy is we have a free workshop offer. It's a first come first served basis, but essentially it's a 4-hour workshop spread across a number of days and hosted by our cloud architect and an information governance expert. And essentially it involves a survey, some scan and analysis of information, evaluations about information management maturity, a cloud migration roadmap, an information governance and compliance blueprint, introduces some tools for compliance processing, knowledging, etc. And finally, demonstrates effective information governance ecosystem design. And essentially what this is, it's a great way to start to answer the questions that Todd was talking about the bookends. What does the strategy and the vision look like, and where are we now? And those are really the two most important questions you can be asking yourself and seeking to answer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. That's going to do it for today's webinar. Thanks for everyone for sticking around on the call. We hope today's webinar has provided you with insight into our outcome-focused approach of what we call smart compliance to support your digital-born strategies and leverage your 365 investment. And as a reminder, please be on the lookout for the email notification about today's webinar being available for replay. So please continue to stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.